I think we're going to talk about the mind, aren't we? The delusions. Okay, so then we just think first, put ourselves in the right direction. We think we're going to listen to these ideas, these Buddhist views, these views from the Buddha about the mind, which means about life, to see if there's some tools we can take from it, thinking like that, to help us develop our amazing potential, the wisdom wing, so we can be a benefit to others. The compassion wing. A bird needs two wings. Okay, and I'll just sing a little Tibetan prayer. The first two lines of which is expressing for those of us who already figure we're Buddhists, so it's reiterating our reliance on the Buddha. And the second two lines is this altruistic reason for being here together, expressing that. Sangye chörang toke chognam la janchu baru dagni kyapsu chi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drupasho Sangye chörang toke chognam la janchu baru dagni kyapsu chi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drupasho Sangye chörang toke chognam la janchu baru dagni kyapsu chi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drupasho. Okay, I mean, we've been talking about it already this week, you know, we've been discussing the mind for sure. I mean, we did certainly Wednesday, in the first 2 days exactly, except talking more of the compassion side, the first 2 days. So you could say that I've noticed in the modern world, a lot of people, so-called Western people, modern people, you know, coming from a Christian Judaic background, let's say, really like Buddhism for the compassion side. You know, if anyone looks at the Dalai Lama, anybody with half a brain can see that the intensity of the suffering he's been through and his people, and look at him, a happy, smiling person. There must be something there, you know, it's clear that love and compassion prevail for him. He's such an example of that. And it's true, it is that. In fact, the point of the Buddhist path is that you end up as an astonishingly empathetic, compassionate person. I mean, the Buddhist idea of ego, when we really we really cut the nonsense inside ourselves, then it's like there's no separation between you and others, as mystical as that can sound to us. So compassion is the point. But as His Holiness says, compassion is not enough. As Lama Zopa says, meaning well is not enough. We need wisdom. So on the face of it, this idea of the wisdom wing, compassion wing, it sounds nice, but I think it's not how we think. This wisdom wing, it sounds a bit puzzling. Wisdom, what do you mean by wisdom? You know, what do you mean by that? Well, one way of putting it is it's the first stages of the path. And necessarily the compassion component is more advanced because it's all presented in an orderly, incremental way according to the level of the disciple. But I mean, it sounds a surprise to us because compassion just sort of seems like it's a thing itself, you know. We don't see it as the result of something. We don't see it as the culmination of something. But actually, it's the more advanced level of practice. In other words, the Buddhist approach, the way it's presented, is that you can't, your compassion, your empathy for others, your love, your wish that they be happy, as we talked Monday and Tuesday, are really limited until you've done the wisdom wing to any degree whatsoever. So that means we have to understand what that means. Well, I mean, when people think about Buddhism, then also you think about mindfulness, meditation, you know, and you hear about karma. So that sounds like Buddhism, you know. So when we think, well, how does that fit with compassion, you know? What's that noise? It's like a train.
Subway. Right here.
Oh, it is the subway.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Welcome to New York City.
But how come I haven't noticed before?
Because the windows are open right now.
That explains it.
I could close them.
No, I don't mind it. You decide. No, I understand. It's okay. Okay, you can decide. You decide that. Okay, so in other words, we have to know what it means. Wisdom. What is wisdom? If it's going to inform your ability to be compassionate and to be able to act to benefit others, which is the whole point of the Bodhisattva path. This Bodhisattva path, the Mahayana component of the Buddhist path. You know. So that's what we're going to be discussing here. The mind, how it functions. So the wisdom wing is the work you do on, the beneficiary of the work in the wisdom wing, if you like putting it this way, is oneself. The emphasis of all the practices are about oneself. So already this sounds peculiar to us because it sounds like it's selfish, So the very first level of practice, I mean, if you're familiar with this Tibetan packaging called the Lam Rim, and if I quote Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who respects the lineage, he would say the first stages of practice are the teachings and practices suitable for the disciple of the least capability. And the next level are those suitable to the disciple of the middle capability. Now that's the wisdom wing. Then you've got the compassion wing, and they are the practices and practices and teachings suitable to the disciple of the greatest capability. That's how they talk. So of course that's an abstract concept for us. We don't think like this. But I like to, because we're so familiar with such concepts, I like to refer to them as junior school, high school, and university. So when we understand that, and you hear the compassion wing is the university level, then we're a bit puzzled. What does that mean? What does that mean? What do you have to have before you're ready for compassion? And that's the wisdom component. So what that is, the very first level, junior school, entry level, grade 1, level of Buddhist teachings, and therefore level of Buddhist practice, is not even about the mind. It's really about your body. It's about controlling the servants of the mind. And this is something very curious to us because we don't think like this. And I always think we just think we're this big lump of me kind of plodding through life. We know we have a body, we know we have speech, we know we have a mind, but we don't sort of separate them. Certainly not in terms of the spiritual practice. That sounds most peculiar, So the mind is the point. For the Buddha, mind is, as we've been discussing, it's absolutely central. And that's, again, surprising in our scientific world, because as far as we're concerned, brain, yes, but the subjective cognitive process itself, we're not so sure about that. I think psychology is on the lowest part on the totem pole, I think, because we don't trust the internal process. We like hard sciences. We want to see something with our microscope, But as we've been talking, the mind in Buddhism is, we're not discussing neuroscience. We're not discussing the brain. Buddha's expertise is not the brain. Buddha's expertise is the actual workings of the subjective process itself, the direct subjective cognitive process itself. This is the unique approach in Buddhism. It is unique to the Buddhist approach, I would suggest. So the mind's the point, but you don't really start to get seriously into the mind, being your own therapist, as Amiyeshi puts it, until you get to high school. So the junior school level, is controlling your body and speech, which sounds just odd to us, but it has such logic when we understand if the mind is the point. Then it's clear that what you say is an expression of what's in your mind. It's clear that what your hand does is an expression of what's in your mind. We don't think of it like that because we just have this unified sense of a big lump of me, mainly the body. So it's really empowering when we understand this. So we need to control the servants of the mind. So we're going to be in high school now. We're going to look at the mind, the components of the mind. We discussed this. We began this on Wednesday, the first module of the mind module. We're going to look at the psychological. We're going to look at the psychological model of the mind. We're going to look at the contents of the mind. In other words, we're going to, and as we discussed on Wednesday, whatever it was, I think, we've got the mental, we've got sensory consciousness, and we have mental consciousness. These are a huge distinction in the Buddhist approach. As we discussed, the sensory is the tip of the iceberg. That's the part of our mind that functions in relation to the eyeball, the nervous system, the skin, the touch, taste, smell, and so on. That's the part of our mind, which is not physical, that exists in dependence upon the gross body and has sensory experiences. So as we discussed, those sensory experiences are profoundly limited. What the mind is capable of cognizing through the eye consciousness is very limited, only shape and color. What ear consciousness is capable of cognizing is merely sound. So when I say, wow, listen to that amazing Miles Davis, the millisecond I hear that and identify it as a trumpet note from Miles Davis, my ear consciousness doesn't cognize that. My ear consciousness cognizes me as sound. And as we discussed, the next millionth of a second, my mental consciousness is accessed, where all my memories are stored. The Buddhist view is very fascinating. There's nothing we've ever seen or done or said or heard or thought about that isn't stored as memories in our mind. And of course, Buddha's talking about many lifetimes. But as we can see, we can access very small amount of it. So the mental consciousness is accessed, and then out comes my mouth. Wow. Amazing, Miles Davis. So that's a thought. So then mental consciousness, as we discussed on Wednesday, you know, the unique approach, not totally unique because it came from the Indians before the Buddha. He came out of this incredibly sophisticated system of study and analysis. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who began the investigation into the nature of self. Of course, we smarty pants modern people thought it was Mr. Freud 100 years ago, you know. I mean, it's kind of interesting. We're only really looking at this now, seeing the extraordinary level of knowledge, sophisticated knowledge, and internal knowledge, which is unique to us in our culture. This is the Indian tradition, and so we're being specifically Buddha here, you know. That we've got these subtler levels of cognition. The best we can do is posit the possibility, because there's nothing equivalent. There's nothing equivalent in neuroscience. Maybe they're investigating it. It's marvelous. And this can only be accessed by accomplishing shamatha, this brilliant psychological skill invented by these Indians. Again, more than 3,000 years ago. It's been that when Buddha diverged in his own direction, he took with him, of course. I mean, he didn't throw out what he'd learned. He carried on and added on to, you could say, he would say. So we've got these subtle levels of cognition. And in the long term, to accomplish the goal of Buddha, to accomplish the goal of ridding the mind of all the rubbish and developing to perfection all the goodness, to accomplish the goal of incredible levels of bodhicitta and realizing emptiness, we need to access these subtle levels. But that doesn't mean we can't do something first on the way at the grosser level, which is where we live at. So the grosser level of our mental consciousness is called conceptuality. And when we can understand this, then we really can be on track with the Buddha's view of the mind. So conceptuality, we understand conceptuality. We think it's up here, you know, thoughts. And we usually think of conceptuality as kind of rational, you know, the rational part, intellect. But the Buddha's part, the entirety of our lives, is we live at the level of conceptuality, which includes clever thoughts and includes what we point to here as emotions. Now, this is the surprise to us. So it's important to understand this. Then we can really work on our minds in the way Buddha's saying. That actually all the emotions, the affliction, you know, the neurotic emotions, the so-called afflictions, the term they use in Buddhist psychology. Actually, Lama Yeshe never used that word. Lama was amazing in the way he translated. He brought the Buddhist concepts into the modern world when he first met the hippies in the 70s, you know. I know from editing him, he never used that word. And somehow he just knew it was an arcane word. We don't use that often in our daily lives. There are many synonyms. Lama made up his own, about 20 of them, to try to convey to us the way these unhappy states of mind work, you know. But the point is that they're conceptual. They're all rooted in being thoughts. I think we can close the windows, don't you? I mean, are we all suffocating from hot?
We won't.
We're fainting from heat? No? I mean, it was good practice, but we don't need to. We don't have to be martyrs. I know one time when I first went to Kopan and I got diarrhea, or dysentery, diarrhea, I think, which is so common back then, not so much these days. And I was at Kopan and I was feeling all this self-pity, and I was thinking I have to put up with it, I'm a Buddhist, you know. And Lama Yeshe walked past and said, you could take a pill. oh, okay. Don't have to be a martyr. Okay, that's better. Yeah. So, okay. So we're looking at the grosser level and all our afflictions, and including, the positive, okay, like we talked on Wednesday, we can divide the mental consciousness into three, at the level that we function, all the conceptions, into three categories. There are those that are neurotic, deluded, I-based, fear-based. This is a serious point. Fear-based, neurotic, deluded, constricted, distorted, delusional. There are many words, you know. I'm going to discuss these tonight. Then you've got the positive, virtuous, useful, appropriate, valid states of mind. that are not delusional, that are not disturbing, that are not afflictions. This first lot are the source of your suffering, and this second lot are the source of your happiness. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's not how we think. The words are pretty straightforward. And the Buddha, by the way, as we've discussed, says we can rid the mind utterly of the first lot, Bud, and we can develop to perfection the second lot, Da. That's the point that Buddha's telling us, you know. So if it's true, we can rid the mind of the first lot. And why would we? Because it's the source of our suffering. And we know we don't want suffering. All this is about us, by the way. This is not about compassion yet. This is the point about this first stages of practice. We are the beneficiaries of this practice. This is something we feel embarrassed about. Oh, that sounds selfish, we'll think, you know. The main basis, for example, for Buddha to exhort us not to kill, steal, lie, this and that, typical good ethics. The typical reason we think, why am I being ethical? Well, it's because people don't like being harmed, which is absolutely true. The Buddha would define a negative action in terms of its being an action that harms another. Therefore, that's a natural law, as opposed to the Christian teaching, as I quoted, and I think it's an important point, that the main thing that defines an action as being negative is because God said. I'm not criticizing that. And that makes sense if you posit a boss, you know. Not for the Buddha. He's not like that. So he defines a negative action done with the body and speech, one that's driven by a delusion, an affliction, is one that harms another. That's the heaviest level of a negative action. And he calls it a negative action because it's a natural law, because people don't like it. It's pretty reasonable. So it's not as if he's telling us you shouldn't do it because he says so, which is our typical view of morality. There's nothing like that. There are levels of Buddha's rules. You know, he created rules when the community started living together. They're like at a relative level, but these big ones, he's done natural laws. He doesn't say don't kill because I say so. He says don't kill, honey, because guess what? It's a negative action, harms others. But the crucial point, the crucial thing, and we miss this continuously, we think it's selfish. The reason first, this is junior school before we get back to the mind. The reason in junior school, entry level, grade 1, to take on board as Buddha's advice, if you choose to, he's not forcing you to not kill and steal and lie, is, he says, because guess what, Robina? They're going to cause you suffering. We really do miss this in the West. We just think it's selfish. No, I can't do that. But that's what renunciation means. That's the first realization you get in the very first level of practice. You give up suffering and its causes. Why? Because you're sick of suffering. And you now know the causes, your own ridiculous actions. That's the energy behind the first level of practice. It's self-respect. Not, I'm a naughty person, I'll get punished. We've got to really take it on board like that. So the same with the next level of practice. Now you've harnessed your body and speech to some degree. You now have the luxury to start really beginning to be a Buddhist. This is where you begin to be a Buddhist. I mean, good ethics is common to any good Hindu, good communist, good Christian, good Muslim. It's common. Good ethics is common. This is the unique Buddhist approach. That what drives the delusions, what drives your body and speech to do actions is the mind. And this is the Buddha's expertise. This is what we are now going to discuss. This is what we have to learn to get deeply inside and begin to unpack and unravel. So this second category of states of mind within the mind, the first ones are the neurotic, deluded, I-based, fear-based ones. And he talks about the 3 poisons, the root delusion. We're going to discuss this one. Such that when it's uprooted, that's what the quote unquote realization of emptiness is all about. That's when you cut the root of samsara. You can't fall back after that. You can only go forward. The root delusion, known simply as ignorance, maripa, unawareness. There's different levels of ignorance, but the root one, the primordial one, the primordial mistaken sense of a separate, bereft, concrete, pointable, findable me. This is the deepest, most primordial. So subtle that it's hard to identify because it's absolutely at the level of an assumption. And in our modern psychological models, we take it as a given. The thing that delusion posits, an inherent self, is the basis of our world. So it's quite hard to identify it. Then on the basis of this separate, the assumption of a separate I, there's the voice, the main voice of that, which is attachment. And effectively in the Four Noble Truths, Buddha says attachment is the main cause of all suffering. This is a shock to us because we have a very different definition of the word attachment. So we need to understand Buddha's word, Buddha's definition. It's not the same state of mind that we talk about. And then when attachment is thwarted, basically, which is 1,000 times a day, The third of these three poisons, aversion. So these are the three of the five we're going to look at. You know, these are the root ones. When we can understand these and unpack and unravel, we can really understand Buddhist psychology. We can really understand Buddha's model of the universe. We can really understand why we suffer and what causes happiness. It's very specific to the Buddha. So, okay, the mental consciousness, the millisecond my eyes see that shape and color, the millisecond my ears hear that sound, mental consciousness is triggered and come up, and all my memories are in there, all the memories and the specific memories of what I decided I like in this life, shape, color, this, that, this kind of music, Miles Davis, blah, all the, in other words, it's a series, it's a bunch of opinions, concepts, viewpoints, thoughts. Concepts are a very gross level of cognition for the Buddhist view of the mind. When you study the epistemological model and you learn about this subtler level, it's just so abstract for us because we don't posit it, you know. It's utterly fascinating. Or even how conceptuality works. I mean, it's totally bizarre. It's extraordinary what these yogis have come up with by observing their own minds, starting from the Buddha. For example, conceptuality, for example, they say the millisecond, you know, I go here, and once eye consciousness has done its job, and then the mental consciousness is accessed, and in the millionth of a second, as we know, up comes, there's a nice mug or whatever it is, or even just a mug. But what happens in the mental consciousness, in the conceptuality, it's like a computer. It's astonishing. What happens is every single tiny memory of anything that I've ever known that's stored in my mind that isn't a mug appears to the mind in a very abstract way as a non-mug. They're all eliminated, and then what is left is merely called a non-mug. That's how conceptuality works. Who would have thought? I mean, it's just completely bizarre to us. And you only can see that when you've got your shamatha, and you can actually see the workings of your own non-physical conceptual level of mind. So it's utterly fascinating, you know, because it's completely abstract how mental consciousness, how conceptuality functions. It's a whole nother discussion. It's completely fascinating. I'm sure Gus will go into it with you. So that's the epistemological model. Now we're looking at the contents. We're looking at these viewpoints, these concepts themselves. So then we live at the conceptual level. Now that doesn't just mean when you're learning music and learning math and learning cakes and you have your clever thoughts. No, the afflictions, the delusions, the emotional, the disturbing thoughts, the disturbing emotions, the delusions, the afflictions, the neurotic states of mind, whatever you want to call them. We experience them at the gross level, which is when the body experiences. And this is, I tell you, we can spend the rest of this weekend just on this specific point, because this is the major block for us. We only notice what our mind is doing when our body experiences it. And this is reinforced in our culture because we only think we're the body. This is the part that's really fascinating. So it's like, and that's the grossest level. The grossest level of our mind is when it gets to the body. So in other words, this is implying we've got these subtler levels of these conceptual stories. So for example, as a child, I had no idea that I was angry until I noticed myself shouting, meaning I didn't know my mind. I didn't observe my thoughts. Now, a person like one of you maybe who doesn't shout, when your attachment is thwarted, your aversion will manifest as like an internalized aversion, and it won't express itself externally, and it'll build up until one day you are inert in bed and can't move. Oh, I must be depressed. Do you understand? Because the body's feeling it. So because we're so addicted to our bodies, we're so addicted to our sensory consciousnesses and our body and the objects of our senses, that unless our thoughts are yelling, we don't notice them. We know they're there. The second we wake up until the second we go to sleep, we know that our mind is flooded, isn't it, by these incoherent thoughts. It's like unedited James Joyce continuously. I mean, I thought, anyway, never mind about James Boyce, who cares? I was going to give a rude opinion about it. So we only notice all those thoughts, and they are thoughts, when they become emotional. That's the thing. When they're shaking, when the body's shaking. That's why we say we feel it in our body. And this is a really good point, to say you feel it in your body. I mean, it's fascinating. The Buddhist approach is the Vajrayana is so helpful in this explanation. It's more advanced, but it's extremely helpful. It's not the way we talk about the brain, for sure. But, you know, according to the Vajrayana model, of how all beings are, you know, how we embodied beings, including animals, we've got gross consciousness and gross body. This is this bag of bones, and our sensory consciousness. That's the first level. And then we've got subtle consciousness and subtle body. And what that's meaning is there's 72,000 subtle channels, our nervous system coursing through the entire body. I've got the subtle 72,000 subtle channels, and then coursing through those channels are all these different wind energies, is prana. This comes from the Ayurvedic system. It's the Chinese one, absolutely the Tibetan medical one. This is how they say we're constructed. I know it's not the brain's one, it's a different model, isn't it? And then all through these, and then they say in the Vajrayana, as His Holiness says, all minds, all beings, all minds are inextricably linked to their own set of the four elements, but at this subtle level, all subsumed in the wind energy. So the subtle wind energy is the basis of our physical, and the subtle mind is our conceptuality. And then all these different states of mind are coursing through these channels along with their winds. So you go to your Tibetan doctor, your Chinese doctor, and she'll feel your imbalance of certain winds, and she'll know immediately it's because of your attachment, or your anger, or your this, or your that, because they all have their own wind, and they all have their, and then when the mind is doing something, it affects the winds. So when your mind is strongly attached, strongly angry, the mind starts, it's the mind, it's the mind. And because it's a habit in my mind, we all know when you build up a habit, it's much more strong. The habit of anger was there immediately. I didn't have to learn it. My mother did not have to teach me. I had it down because I got born with it. It was very quick, you know, very quick. The millisecond my attachment didn't get what it wanted, the aversion exploded because the habit was so strong. I had it perfected. So that means the more strongly angry thoughts, look at a person who's angry. It's so clear. They're shaking, aren't they? Look at that child, screaming, shaking, spit out the mouth, eyes wide, tears, the body literally shaking. Because the anger is so strong, so habitual in the mind, and the wind energies connected to the anger are completely berserk. So no wonder we feel things in our body. It makes sense. It is physical. The winds are the physical part. And then it affects your nervous system, affects all the rest of your body, affects your health. It's a very integrated, delicious kind of model, you know. Makes complete sense, of course, the body. But we only notice it when it's physical. Meaning the mind goes to incredibly subtle levels. And these concepts, we're going to go into how they are concepts, how anger is a concept, how pride is a concept. We're going to discuss this because that's what it is. It's a grosser level. But there are subtler levels of these concepts. But we don't even notice them at a subtle level. We don't even notice our gross level, even at, you know, only at the grossest gross level, when the body is affected. Then we notice we feel something. And it's just too late. It's just too late. It's really simple. That dumb example I used, but it's such a good one. It's like you've never heard of car mechanics. You didn't know such a thing existed. And you've got this brand new car and you drive and you drive and you drive it to the ground, and 100 miles an hour one day, the wheels are falling off, and then you notice. Because we don't have a method. It's a serious point. We have maintenance for our buildings. Everything we know about, we're brilliant at maintaining. You don't wait till your teeth fall out before you go to the dentist. You don't wait till we know that if you're taking care of everything. But in mind, we literally do not have these techniques. Still, I don't think we do. I mean, even we still think of going to a therapist when it's serious. You only go to the therapist when the wheels are off, you know. If you go to your therapist when you're feeling slightly annoyed, she will dismiss you. You're just a normal person, Robina. Well, slight annoyance is a low level of aversion, and it will build up because nothing goes astray. Everything stays in the mind and builds up, you know, dependent arising. So the job, if we don't even get anywhere near realizing emptiness, we get nowhere don't get anywhere near compassion, really genuine compassion. We can learn to become familiar with the thoughts, even at a slightly subtler level, before it becomes out of control. This is what we can get from the Buddhist teachings, I tell you. This is not religion, it's intelligence. but you have to pay attention. And you have to want to look at your mind. That's already the stumbling block. Why would I want to look at my mind when I can blame my girlfriend, you know? I mean, I'm not being sarcastic even. That's the function of ego, automatically to externalize it. We know we feel something, we feel annoyed, but it's the husband because he's eating his breakfast wrong. And that's true, he is. He's making a big slurpy sound. It's true, let's say he is. But that's the event. And of course, the analysis we do, and this is the samsaric analysis, and we all do it, is we assume I'm annoyed because of that slurping food, you know. So naturally, we ask him to stop doing it. That's the world. It's how we live our lives. So it's a shock to hear that maybe the other option is I should look at my mind and change my aversion to something else. Of course, it's difficult. That's just slurping his dinner. But you got to start small, you know, but we wait till you want to kill him. Then you better go to the therapist, you know. So, okay, how is it then, these emotions, let's see logically how they are, they're rooted in being conceptual stories, but we only notice them when they're explosive emotions, when the body's shaking. Well, the key function, and this is also including love and compassion, by the way, they're all conceptual levels as well. They're all conceptual states of mind. They're all rooted in being conceptual states of mind. When we've realized them internally, that's when they're genuine, when we finally realize the virtues, spontaneously got love and compassion and bodhicitta, then they're beyond conceptual. And it's sort of like you learn your musical theory, and then eventually you've perfected it. It's beyond theory now, isn't it? You've got it down. Same here. I mean, I'd perfected anger, in other words. I'd realized anger. It was automatic. I didn't have to work it out. I didn't have to think, well, my sister just, you know, she'd call me cockeye because my eye goes in. I got one eye that goes right in, not right now because they're relaxed. But I have to see, I've got to go right into my nose. And she'd have to just say cockeye once, and that was the end of me. I'd be destroyed, you know. I was a bully to all my other sisters, but this one sister, she just could get me. Then I'd be trying and angry and stamping and yelling and distressed, you know. So I perfected anger. So if you've perfected it, you can de-perfect it, can't you? So you can learn new habits, you know. So, yeah, so same with love and compassion. They're also rooted in conceptual, and we've got to start with the conceptual. We've got to start reprogramming our conceptual stories to grow love and compassion. And this is a brand new way for us to think, because we just think when you do a meditation on compassion, you've got to have a nice gooey feeling, you know. That's just superficial until it's perfected. And it's got to be perfected deep in our bones at the conceptual level. That's why all the various, the various meditations, starting with equanimity, that would culminate in bodhicitta. The methodology is clear logical analysis to argue with ego's misconceptions. So, okay, then these delusions, these afflictions, that they are, you know, they're the emotional ones. They're not the only delusions. I mean, the Buddha would say not realizing cause and effect is also a delusion, but it's more like a philosophical one that's so rooted in our being, and it's not directly an emotion, but it's a misconception for sure. But these are the emotional ones, you know, very powerful ones that drive the universe. So the three poisons, as he calls them, these three toxic emotions, you know, the ego grasping, and there's a hierarchical relationship between them. They're not just three random states of mind. There's the root delusion that underpins everything, known colloquially as ego grasping. Then there's attachment on the basis of that, and then aversion on the basis of attachment. And then the others are all branched from there, you know. So let's look at how they are conceptually, how they're all concepts, rooted in being concepts. In fact, the definition of a negative state of mind, the definition of an affliction, is a conceptual story, a concept that exaggerates the deliciousness. Now, all of them exaggerate. All delusions, why they're delusional, this is a great word in English, why they cause us to not be in touch with reality, which means delusional. Why they are called delusions is because the degree to which one or other of them is prevailing in your mind is the degree to which the object the boyfriend, the cake. It's the degree to which the object appears mistakenly, literally mistakenly. So all the delusions exaggerate. Attachment exaggerates the deliciousness of the boyfriend in the beginning, or the cake, or whatever it is, you know. Attachment exaggerates the deliciousness, meaning the stronger that habit in your mind to be attached to chocolate cake from habit, even the thought of it, you know, the mind gets excited, isn't it? And then when you see the cake, literally you see that shape and color, you're correct in labeling it chocolate cake. That's a valid cognition. But attachment is totally filling your mind. You've got your attachment glasses on, and the stronger the habit, the more attachment is there, the thicker the lenses, the more divine that cake will appear. Now, we know this experience. We just don't join the dots, you know, because what happens is bad enough, as Lama Zopa says, that the cake appears back to us wrongly, bad enough that we believe it's true. This is what keeps us in samsara, actually. So the key function of all the delusions is that they're misconceptions. They exaggerate. And the stronger the habit, the stronger the exaggeration and the stronger the emotion. So for me, because anger was a habit, the more ugly my sister looked to me at that time, the more emotional I would get, the more I'd scream and yell. And as we know, as your mother says, when you're like that, you're making mountains out of molehills. It's a perfect way to put what a delusion is. It makes mountains out of molehills. It exaggerates. We know this, but we don't see it like that. We don't have that analysis. We just go, oh, well, that's how he is. He's just angry, you know. His habit, and the delusion is there, and it informs the way the cake appears to you. Not only that, it exaggerates, and it's multifaceted. All these delusions are multifaceted. So attachment, you know, it's coming. So what's it coming from? What's inside? What's inside? This is the interesting point about the sense of an I, a separate I. We're just speaking very casually about the consequences of this ego grasping, this root delusion. It is, the literal definition is it's this negative state of this concept that exaggerates the very ontological status itself of the I, over exaggerates it makes it concrete, solid, and separate. And this is a very odd idea, to think that a mistake is that you feel like you're separate. Of course, we're separate, we'll say. It's a weird idea. But you could argue when you realize emptiness and you've got bodhicitta, it's like your I is as big as the universe. You know, you identify so utterly with every other being as if there were no separate I. You could say like that. And we know the more miserable you are, the more angry, the more depressed, the more proud, the more low self-esteem, the more jealous, the more separate and lonely you are. That's a really vivid one we see. But there's a whole world out there, and there's poor little isolated me. That's exactly how the delusions make us function, you know, make us feel. So they exaggerate. So each one exaggerates. So the chocolate cake, you know, the I consciousness sees that color, it's correct. The mental consciousness identifies as chocolate cake, correct, tick the box. But then attachment is like pervading everything. It colors everything. I know when my mother used to make cakes and she'd put this in cochineal, one drop of this pink stuff into the icing of the cake, and it just pervaded the whole icing, you know, the whole white thing became pink. Attachment's like that. It pervades everything. The whole thing is pervaded by this color, this taste. This attachment causes the cake to appear back to you as incredibly delicious. But not just that. We also know the function of attachment is it over-exaggerates the role of the cake in making me happy. This is the main one. Why we just can't not put it in the mouth, you know. Frantic not to get it. And there's all this story building up well before you get to the cake. And so attachment comes from this terrible feeling. The most primordial level of attachment is dissatisfaction. So why dissatisfaction? I mean, again, we can spend the rest of the weekend just on this point. Why is dissatisfaction a function of having practiced attachment? Because attachment is exaggeration. So let's just say you got a $50 note, but you really believe it's 500. And you've believed it for so long that it appears to you as 500. So you believe it's 500, you expect 500's worth, you have that level of anticipation, that level of excitement, and you totally believe it, and you go out there and you spend it, and what is the result? Disappointment, dissatisfaction. So because you've practiced believing that cakes and bodies and handbags and all the external objects of the universe are the cause of your happiness, attachment caused you to believe that for countless lifetimes, Buddha says, the habit is so primordial, and we keep beating our head against a brick wall every time because we forget that it's not. Then dissatisfaction is the natural consequence. You're bitterly disappointed every time you don't get the $500 worth. And then that builds up, that disappointment builds up. So it's dissatisfaction. We get born with this. And not only the dissatisfaction we have in our culture is really serious. Not only do I don't have enough, I am not enough. That's how deeply ours is, you know. That's from the habit of having practiced attachment for so many lifetimes. Now we can think of some people we know who are more satisfied, and we're puzzled. Maybe they're poor, maybe they're ugly, but they're satisfied. So it feels like so odd, you know, how come? Do you understand? We notice, but we don't join the dots again because they've got the consequences of not much attachment. So they get born in this life with a more satisfied mind, more content, and also therefore more loving, more kind. Because this is the point about the wisdom wing. You know, there's various about the wisdom wing. Never mind, we'll get there. So the wisdom one very clearly is a very accurate word. If all the delusions exaggerate certain components, certain aspects of the object, anger exaggerates the ugliness, attachment exaggerates the deliciousness, pride exaggerates your importance, low self-esteem exaggerates your lack of importance, you know, all of them exaggerate. So we're never in touch with reality. So literally we don't have wisdom. We're living in la-la land. But it seems puzzling because we just think this is normal world. This is normal. Attachment is normal. Anger is normal. What we mean by normal is that you'd be abnormal if you didn't have them. That's how we think. In other words, we give equal status to anger, love, compassion, jealousy, you know, hopefully lesser than neurotic ones and more of the positive, but it all seems a bit potluck, how you're born and what you get, you know. But we give equal status to them all, as if that's a normal person. That's why it's so shocking to hear the Buddha saying quite clearly, sorry, guys, you don't need these neurotic ones. In fact, you can get rid of them utterly. That's what he means by nirvana. It's not some place like heaven. It's the word used to refer to the accomplishment in your mind once you've done the job of ridding the mind of the rubbish, you know. Forget the bodhicitta part, which is the compassion one. So it's quite radical what Buddha's saying. And we're talking psychology here, not some spirit. Talk about your mind. So if these habits are so primordial, it really does take time. You really need shamatha. You need to get to be at the subtle level of mind in order to really do the uprooting, to really do the logical analysis, to unpack and unravel and deconstruct and rid the mind utterly by arguing with them, not just kind of mystically flying away. It's really hard, intense work. And it starts where we are at the gross level. So literally, wisdom is what you get as you lessen these delusions. The bonus is also you'll get more happy and more content. They're like the bonus. But directly, why they're called the wisdom wing, because finally when you realize emptiness, the final wisdom, you'll really be in touch with reality now. So attachment is dissatisfaction, meaning every second, whatever it is, it's there. Whatever's there, it's not enough, or it's wrong. It's not the right thing. We absolutely know this. Now, this is where it's get confusing because there are some things that you can change and it's really appropriate. In other words, if you just completely think, I've got to be nihilistic now and be satisfied with whatever's in front of me, and someone's offered you a plate of caca, I'm forced to eat it. No, be reasonable. Don't eat the caca, you know, or even you go to the cafe, simply you wanted cafe latte at 180 degrees, and only give it 120. It's okay if you're really relaxed about it. No, I'd rather have it 180 if I can. It's okay to get what you want. If you can change something, it's okay to change it. But we have to know when it becomes obsessive, because these delusions are basically all obsessive compulsive, basically. We're all obsessive compulsive, okay? We're all OCD. We're all bipolar, and I'm not being sarcastic. I promise. ADHD. We all suffer from trauma. We all have PTSD. These are just the words we use in modern psychology to refer to the different terms that Buddha would use for the suffering that's caused by delusions. I'm not being sarcastic. So if we are being Buddhist, I just find it, because I have to talk about it all the time, I just find it so helpful to keep using the Buddhist analysis and checking up to see how I can equate the two, you know, to bring them together. It's very helpful. So all delusions exaggerate their function. So attachment, effectively the main cause of our suffering in day-to-day life as far as the Four Noble Truths are concerned. Dissatisfaction. Therefore, naturally, if you're dissatisfied with what's there, and this is the point, we can't even be reasonably, we don't know how to be conventionally reasonable, you know? Unless you have to use your common sense, you have to learn to develop common sense. If you can change something, fine. So, you know, we're exaggerating. We're not happy. We're not satisfied. So then you start to hanker after, oh, good cake. So you get all overexcited. You start visualizing the cake. You start visualizing the cake, imagining the cake. So then your intention comes, I'm going to get cake. And all the time you're doing that, you're anticipating the cake. You're building up, anticipating, getting all excited, imagining it. And the more the attachment, the heavier it is. I mean, look at when we're junkies. Look at when we're completely attached to one person or one thing, or when the mind becomes completely narrow. We can see that. Obsessive, no question. We can see that. The stronger the attachment to that object. So the build-up of the single pointedness to get it, and the stronger the attachment, and this is where when it's really fierce. Look at the harm people do. Look at anger. Anger is the response when attachment is thwarted. Anger is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, and that could be 1,000 times a day. You know. So if you look at anybody in the world who's angry, and don't worry about what Mr. Putin's mother did to him, or these people who are killing, dropping bombs on the railway station and putting people's hands behind their back and executing them. It's called anger. There's more to it as well. There's also heavy levels of anger, but basically it's anger and a buildup of anger. They've never met these people before. It's violent anger, which is the response because attachment hasn't been getting what it wants. Of course, it's coming from karma too. This is where you can only go so far in understanding the mind of people, and if you don't factor in karma, you know, this is the Buddhist view. So attachment is dissatisfaction. It then hankers and comes up with something to get, and then you get it, and then if it's cake, you know, the habit, we know the habit, it goes into this hole. We don't worry about what hole it goes in when you get the cake. Oh, where did it have to go? This one? This one? No, we know the one because the habit is, we're programmed, right? We know. Mummy doesn't have to teach us because we're programmed. It's what Buddha means by instinct. Instinct is just having done something that often it's automatic, you know. So then you get the cake, and then the real suffering, and this is where, I mean, it's quite subtle to see the suffering. It's quite subtle because we think of it as happiness. This is where the Four Noble Truths, the first one is there is suffering. The second, there are causes. The third, you can get rid of suffering and its causes. And the fourth is how to do it. Well, in the first one, there are 3 levels of suffering. And to understand attachment, we have to understand the second level of suffering. The first kind of suffering is called the suffering of suffering. And that's easy. That's when the bad things happen. That's when the bad things happen. That's when attachment doesn't get what it wants, which is a brutal way to put it, but it's how it is. You know? The suffering of suffering is when the bad things happen. The suffering of change, the next one, is when attachment does get what it wants. It's a subtler level of suffering, but very hard to see because our minds are so gross. We just know if you're hungry, that's the suffering of suffering. And then you get cake, and that's called happiness. But we have to do the analysis, and this is the way attachment works. You have to do the analysis. All this build up, all this emotion, and the deepest one, go right back to inside again before we go further. The deepest one driving attachment, this is the part that's so shocking. The deepest one that's driving the attachment is this concrete sense of an I, a concrete I. And it's gigantic grasping, but it's a very tiny I, a very miserable I, a very nothing I. It's like attachment is a symptom of a really mentally ill person. Join the universe, that I'm nothing. So the stronger you have the feeling that I'm nothing and bereft and lonely, the more gigantic the attachment, the more hungry, the more violent the dissatisfaction is, meaning I'm nothing. I'm nothing, not just I haven't got anything, but I'm nothing. Attachment is a symptom of a very tiny person. So then we have to put all that into something to get something to fill up the gaping hole. This is talking even the sense objects. Forget the subtle level of attachment, which is the attachment to being seen and heard and approved of. Another whole discussion. So the more dissatisfied, the more you hanker, the more you exaggerate the chocolate cake, and the more you then, so this is what you do the analysis, to try and see how it's in the nature of suffering. It's hard to hear this. It feels cruel of Buddha to tell us that the attachment we have is actually the nature of suffering. It's really hard to see. It's really hard to see this. We have to do the analysis. But before we do this, we have to understand another state of mind. Without understanding where this fits in the whole model, we get confused. And that's the state of mind called feeling. In the third category of states of mind, they're called neutral. I like to call them the mechanics of the mind. Intention, it's bare bones volition, not meaning motivation. Intention is I will. Everything exists on the tip of the wish, Lama Zopa says. Intention is the meaning of karma. It's one of these neither virtuous nor non-virtuous states of mind. They call neutral insofar as they're not virtuous and not non-virtuous, but I call them the mechanics, because these parts of your mind, if they're all functioning nicely, you function. Whether you're a murderer or a meditator, you have an intention. I will kill. I will eat cake. I will be kind. That's got no flavor to it. It's a bare bones volition. Then you've got attention. You pay attention. That's neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. Then you have recognition. Well, that's gray and that's pink. That's not virtuous or non-virtuous. It's just necessary. Then you have concentration. Then you have one called mindfulness, which is simply the ability to remember what you're doing. Thieves need mindfulness, as Lama Zopa says. It's not virtue or non-virtue. We've got to understand these concepts. Otherwise, we don't understand Buddhism. So the other one in this category is very fascinating. It's called feeling. And there's only three kinds. It's not the equivalent of a word like emotion. There's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Forget the neutral. So there we've got pleasant and unpleasant. Now listen to this. Pleasant feeling is another word for happiness. Happy feeling, pleasant feeling, joy. Think of even like big levels of it, ecstasy. I mean, I've never had that one, ecstasy, rapture. They're all variations of pleasant feelings. We experience pleasure in the sensory, through the senses and the mental consciousness, but mostly for us, it's the senses. So that's happiness. Now, we so confuse happiness, one, with the object, and two, believing the cake is the cause of my happiness. And even two, we even conflate the cake with the happiness. So when you tell me about your, tell me why you're happy, Robina. And I'll tell you about the cake. I will tell you the day, the rainbow, the person. We are so addicted to the external. We believe that happiness is the cake, is the picnic, is the boy. Pleasure is a mind. It's not physical. It impacts upon the sensory, but it's a state of mind. And it's pleasure or not pleasure, unpleasant or pleasant, and then levels and levels of those. And there's one of these every millisecond. It's just the way it is. The universe is this way. It's just the way it is, the way people are, the way minds are. And as Buddha says, we all want the pleasant feelings and we all don't want the suffering feelings. So what drives us throughout the universe for countless eons to get pleasant feelings is attachment. And then when aversion, when we get the unpleasant feeling and meet the object that triggers an unpleasant feeling, then attachment kicks in and then is wanting to be free of the unpleasant feeling. So attachment is running the universe. Its job is to make, it's this constant hunger to get contact with an object, because we believe that it comes from the object. Get contact with an object such that when you get it in whichever hole it is, pleasure is triggered. So we believe the cake is the cause of that pleasure. Now, the point is, it does trigger pleasure. It's a catalyst for it. It's not the main cause. But look, this is so obvious, it's embarrassing. We know perfectly well the first mouthful, it is incredibly delicious. There's real pleasure is triggered, there's no doubt. There's pleasure triggered, there's no question. As you're eating the first mouthful, but look what's happening. Already you're dissatisfied. It's not enough. That's why you're already anticipating the second mouthful. We are like this. It's just how it is. So there's not a millisecond that attachment is there, but you're ever satisfied. We think we get satisfaction, but only after the fourth piece, and you put the cake down because you'd vomit if you didn't. We call that satisfaction, but it's not satisfaction. That's now turned into aversion. So what Buddha's telling us is that suffering of change is the second level that's triggered by attachment. That seems it does trigger some level of pleasant feeling, but as you're having that pleasant feeling, it's not enough pleasant feeling. So you want a second piece. And we all know from looking back that it's the first mouthful is the best. That first puff of the cigarette, the first everything of the object, of the pleasurable object, that's the best. But it's down and it's downhill from there. And why do we keep eating the cake? Because we're not satisfied. And then what happens? Eventually, that cake on the plate, still even warm, a few pieces are out of it, but now how does it look to your eyes? How the shape and color, but now what is the concept saying? Ugly. And you know, if you eat one more piece, you would vomit. This is how we lead our lives, swinging like drunken sailors between pleasure and pain, and wonder why we never get satisfied, wonder why we get depressed, wonder why we get angry. This is why, this is why, this is why. So it's a depressing, because when we think, well, what the hell does Buddha want from us? I mean, has he got a solution? The trouble is the way he lays it all out, he doesn't tell us the solution immediately. We've got to kind of wait, you know. He rubs our nose in it first. This is why Lama Yeshe was so marvelous, because he can see we're also impatient. And he would, you know, talk immediately to us about the nature of mind, how joy is the nature of our mind. And he would describe it. And so, for example, in the text, you don't have these lamas telling you about the blissful consequences of getting shamatha. They'll tell you the technical stages of getting shamatha. But Lama would talk about the qualities you'd accomplish. He said almost unimaginable, just getting shamatha. And this is the point about pleasure now. Pleasure. You see, when we say pleasure, we conflate it with attachment, so we think it's naughty. We just automatically get guilty, you know. If there's a lot of pleasure, we think it's a sin. Even the word pleasure is a bit naughty, you know. Happiness seems okay, but pleasure, not so sure. Pleasure is just happy feeling. That's all it is. So the Buddha's saying, basically the Buddha's telling us, listen, you guys, I have found a method to get such pleasure, you won't believe it. I'm really serious. And his method is this. So he says, you guys, I'm so sorry, you think now, this is samsara, you think that pleasant feelings are what we get when we get the object of attachment. That's exactly our methodology, isn't it? We anticipate that pleasure when we get the cake, and the pleasure does come, but they call it, they say it's contaminated pleasure. And then the pleasure doesn't get better, it goes down, until eventually, inexorably, before we realize it, it's turned into unpleasure. It's turned into feeling disgusted. We know this. So Buddha's saying, you think pleasant feelings, pleasure, happiness, joy, contentment, whatever word you want, you think that's what you will get when you get an object of the senses. He says, no, no, no. Sorry, an object of attachment, that's the right word. When you get the object of attachment. He says, no. Happiness, joy, pleasure, contentment, fulfillment is what you get when you give up attachment. What's left when you've given up. It's a bit like when you know, if you see a junkie, we're all junkies, don't worry, I'm not being critical to one degree or another. It's a question of degree and a question of object. When a serious junkie, alcohol, these really brutal, you know, objects like alcohol or heroin or something, it's fairly evident to anybody else, isn't it, looking on, that when you get that drink, that supposed satisfaction that causes the person to crave the next drink is actually nothing like, it's like a disgusting pleasure. You can see it's not pleasure. It's really clear. But we're in the middle of it. We can't see it. So the Buddha is saying, there's another point I was going to make and I got lost there. But the Buddha is saying that the natural, this is the point that Lama Yeshe tries to drive home, that that our mind, our consciousness, our mind just naturally is blissful, is happy, is content, is joyful to the degree that there's no attachment, or the other delusions for that matter. So the Buddha's method for getting happy is give up delusions, give up attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, low self-esteem, despair, and all the other mental illnesses. That's the emphasis in Buddhism. We can hear the words, it's not complicated, but it's so shocking because it's against the grain, you know, and because we are all junkies. I mean, even just getting single point of concentration, even a little bit of concentration, because temporarily your delusions are kind of quiet. So even the degree to which your delusions can be quiet, you know, is the degree to which you're joyful. Your mind is joyful naturally, just naturally. The joy is the natural state of a mind that's unencumbered by delusions. So that's even more simply a mind that's unencumbered by delusions. Is the more a mind is less attached, less angry, less depressed, less jealous, and therefore more kind, more loving, to that degree a mind is happy. So in other words, literally virtuous states of mind right now, we have to practice, and then the result of them is happy feelings. And then the lessening of delusions brings happy feelings. So it's a technical thing the Buddha's making. It's not moralistic. Oh, I've got to give up cake and sex and everything. He's not saying that. Our natural state is to be happy when the mind is not deluded. So suffering is caused by delusions. Suffering is caused by depression, anger, jealousy. But it's unfortunate for us. We think, yeah, I know I'm depressed and angry and jealous, but it's my boyfriend, it's this and the trauma that happened to me. And I'm not being sarcastic here. Things do happen to us. Suffering does happen to us. There's no question about that. But it's hard to reverse this energy and start to look, well, I'm suffering because of that trauma. That's a common thing we talk now. And of course, we've suppressed it. We can analyze that. Why do we suppress? It's clear. We understand attachment and aversion. So delusions exaggerate. Attachment is the one that drives the others. The root delusion is the ego grasping, but attachment, and then when it doesn't get, it's like a more subtle way of talking about attachment is that it's like it is at the level of assumption. There's just an assumption there that I must get only the nice things. That's really the most broad way of saying what attachment is. It's an assumption that I must only get the nice things, and it's even a more whatever the adjective is for hubris. You don't say hubristic, do you? Hubric, can't say that either. But the hubris of attachment is, I only deserve happiness, happy feelings. There's an assumption of the I that I only deserve happy feelings. And we know that because look when unhappy things come. I don't deserve. That's the real assumption deep in our bones. All of this we have to unpack and unravel and argue with and see clearly how they're misconceptions. It's really intense work, I tell you. So attachment is the assumption that I must only get the nice things. In other words, attachment is so fragile, it makes us so fragile that we can't cope when unnice things happen. Look at how we lose our minds. This is not being negative. It's just trying to do the Buddhist analysis. Why do you think we are so traumatized by suffering? Because attachment can't stand it. Aversion arises and it's so intense, we lose our minds sometimes. It's so hard to bear. So what do we do with it? We either destroy it, kill it, murder people like people are doing now, and they don't even know why themselves they're doing it. You don't even know why you want to murder people. The habit is there. The aversion is there, so deep. Or you bury it, but it can never go astray. It can never disappear. No thing we've ever seen or touched or heard or smelled or tasted ever goes astray, ever. It's always stored in the mind. So it's going to pop up one way or another. So the more, every time something bad happens, I mean, this is just how attachment and aversion work. As a little girl, something bad happens, you know? And if you're a quiet person and someone's mean to you, the commonest way would be you'd put it away. It'd be like a shock to have this thing happen, a shock. And then you'd put it away because you can't cope. You just can't cope. My method was to punch. Some people are like that, you know. Other people put it away. And it builds up one day. It builds up, you know. So this is the thing about if we can start to, this is where we're really starting to think about emptiness, and we're leaping now to the end result. And we can start to, if we can have the courage, and this is why I think, no, okay, sorry, jumping around. But you can see yourself, anybody who even does therapy, not even does therapy, who does therapy, you've got all this suffering, you go to a nice, wise person who's a sounding board for you. You feel safe to bring up the stuff that you've buried all your life. You know how cathartic it is. You know how powerful it is. And that why it then dissipates is because you're looking at it. If we can be brave enough to look at that thing and not resist it, then there will not be suffering. I'll use this dumb example of when I was held up in New York in 1974 on the Lower East Side at 2 a.m. A fellow put a gun in my breasts right there. I mean, it's just my personality, but I learned from it. You know, this dude, he said, give me your money, right? It was very funny, actually, because my sister, we'd been in an Irish bar and she used to sort of steal things sometimes. Shoplifted, we don't do it anymore. But she had a glass of wine. She had a glass of wine. And he kept saying, give me your money, you know? And so what happens to me when people boss me around, I'm very bossy, I boss right back. I started arguing, kind of debating with him, you know? And it was so clear to me, I said, and I don't want to say F word here, but I said the F word quite a few times. And I was like his mum, you know? First of all, I saw he was more scared than me. That was very crystal clear. I come super clear. And then, and I kept saying, excuse me. It was shocking to hear this funny English accent. Too. Americans get very confused when they hear an English accent. I said, we're just as poor as you. You give me your money. And it was he's so shocked by this, you know. He kept saying, give me your money. And I said, no. And then Jana kept saying, give him some money. I said, no, you give me your money. And then she said, have some wine, brother. I mean, it was like a comedy, you know. But the thing I learned from that, this is the point, it happened, even when I was a little girl, it was the same. Fear turned into aggression for me, you know, and logic. So the fear was, I kind of channeled the fear and it became logic and aggression. And in the end, he shrugged and walked away. Now, I have that was my party story. I had no trauma. I had no PTSD. I didn't have to see a therapist. I'm not being sarcastic now. It's just my nature, right? Because why? And that's what I learned. And when I heard about Buddhism, that's when I really learned it. When there's no fear, which means when you confront something, there's no suffering. Do you hear me, people? I'm not trying to show off. I'm just as ridiculous as everybody else. But it happened. And I learned from it massively. When there's no fear, there's no suffering. This is what Buddha's telling us. So when we can learn, this is why I'm getting the point here. Also, because we wait until it's vomiting out of the mouth or wait till we're inert in bed to notice we're depressed or angry or whatever, if we can learn by using our simple mindfulness every day and learn to pay attention to what the hell is going on in here before we start pointing fingers out there, and we will get better and better and better at it, then we can start to unpack and unravel and see the attachment story and hear the anger story and hear the jealousy story and learn to argue with them. So that's why the real, for example, patience, you know, they only really talking seriously about patience when you get to the Bodhisattva path. It's one of the 6 perfections. Patience is accepting the thing that just triggered your anger. Anger is, oh my God, look at that thing. How dare this happen to me? Why is this happening? And we have a complete panic attack, right? Because attachment can't stand that thing. Attachment only wants the nice things. Attachment is a little fragile person in there, only wants to be treated nicely. Are we communicating here? It sounds brutal because suffering is terrible on this planet. So patience is seeing it and greeting it. The thing that you're like, start with the red light, please. Don't wait to be held up with a gun, Start with a red light instead of just cursing it. We just think that doesn't matter. But every time you do that, that's called anger, and that'll build up in your mind. Every time I always use the dumbest example of dropping a cup while you're doing the dishes. I've never met anybody who doesn't get angry with himself. Do you understand my point? Just breaking a cup. You get guilty, one who's watching you. What's mummy going to say? Oh my God, I broke a cup, so bad. All this trauma that just happens. But so you catch that moment and you argue with it. It's okay, Robina, break another one. I mean, I'm not joking, but that's what being your own therapist means. But we wait till it's serious before we try to then, unpack it. Unpack the baby events. This is the real skill. I'm not even talking about having single point of concentration yet. Catching your mind when it's just called annoyance. Annoyance is a mild version of anger. No wonder we get exhausted by the end of the day, isn't it? Because if you've been resisting all the time and shouting at Mr. Putin and getting angry about the Russians, getting upset about the Ukrainians, and angry about the next door neighbor, and angry about the racism, and angry about this mild anger, you're not throwing things. What do you think your poor mind is like by the end of the day? We think, oh, it doesn't matter. It's only small. I'm allowed to think this, because we're not noticing how we're harming ourselves. That's the point. It's not moralistic. We hear it as moralistic. I'm allowed to be angry, we will say. Yes, you are. You're allowed to stab yourself. Yes, you are. But we have to see the consequences. That's all Buddha's telling us. He's saying, sweetie pies, try and see the pain that your depression, your anxiety, your stress, your anger causes you. This is what takes us time, because we kick and struggle against it, and we just think it sounds like you're blaming me, I'm allowed to be angry. Look what they do. We feel that so strongly, and it's really hard to see an option. Like, if I'm not going to be angry with the Russians, what am I going to do? Because we just assume the opposite is, oh, well, the Russians are okay. That's absurd. And that's why I love the way Martin Luther King, I always quote this. He said, I remember when I was an old radical lefty, I thought he was a bit kind of weak, I liked Malcolm X better. But now I've just read a book about how they're more the same, and I agree. They're both wonderful. Anyway, I remember Martin Luther King, he was patient. It was clear he was a patient person. And he said, it's good to be angry. And he meant it's good to find fault. But then you say, what can I do to help? That's compassion. So that's not, seeing a fault does not mean angry. But we assume if you see a fault, it assumes it's anger. But no, that's not true. Seeing a fault is common sense, is intelligence. There is injustice. There is a war. That guy did have a gun in my chest, and it's not appropriate. That's unethical behavior. That's not cool. That's correct. But anger is an extra thing on top that there's offended and panic-stricken because attachment isn't getting what it wants. Attachment wants it to all be lovely. Then we add anger on top. So we have to make this distinction between anger and finding fault. It's the fact that there's a war in Ukraine. That's not anger. So you don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, everything's lovely. And that's where often you can see the two extremes we are. Some people are just naturally patient, and some people are just naturally, volatile, like me. And I have to try and learn not to chuck the baby out the bathwater, because the negative side of patient people, and you know your own mind when I say this, because you don't get angry when something goes wrong, what you do is you put up with it, but you often put up with things that you shouldn't put up with. That's passivity. That's just weak. That's lazy. So patient people have to learn to be active, and angry people have to learn to be patient. And do you understand what I'm trying to say here? So it's much more nuanced than we think. And that's wise, because the Buddhist view of the mind, there's this distinction between the neurotic ones and the valid ones. They're not the same, The neurotic ones are exaggerating, distorted, eye-based, panic-stricken. The positive ones are reasonable, valid, grounded, appropriate. We have to, that's why it's more nuanced than we think, When we say anger, we also mean finding fault. Nothing wrong with finding fault, but then you think, what can I do to fix it? That's called compassion. That's completely different. But just finding fault, normally never satisfied, that's wrong, that's wrong cup of tea, that's anger. It's finding fault. I mean, if I get my cup of tea, my coffee, well, I don't, anyway, when I used to get lots of Starbucks, 180 degrees exactly, and if it wasn't, It's still a fact that it's not 180. And I can still point it out. That doesn't mean I'm angry. You have to distinguish, there's a bit, this is a revelation when we can get it. It's more nuanced than we think, So we either completely are passive and put up with nonsense, or we violently attack it, It's much more nuanced than that. So patient people have to look at your mind. It's marvelous you've got patience, but you have to also act. And if there's something wrong, fix it. Don't be passive. Are we communicating? So the distinction between virtues and non-virtues, these kind of holy sounding words, is the delusions are neurotic, fear-based, I-based, distorted, delusional, disturbing. They're awful. And you can have as much theory as you like until you start looking inside. You're not going to see. That's why we've got to look inside. We've got to start becoming conscious. We've got to start recognizing and knowing what that state of mind is, knowing its definition, quite literally. We have this level of clarity when it comes to being a nutritionist, to anything else. You've got to have clarity. You don't just say, oh, yes, you just feel good when you eat food. You've got to be very precise about the food. Clear definitions. Same here about the mind. I think I've talked a bit much tonight. What's happening? Oh, I've got to go home and 7:30. Oh my God, look at an hour and a half already. Oh, I'm so sorry. I haven't stopped all night. Oh my God, there's no time for questions because I've got 15 minutes. I've got to get back. I forgot I've got to give a talk to the Sydney Centre at 8 o'clock. So I've got 15 minutes for questions. Come on. Yes. We're going to continue the weekend anyway.
You mentioned earlier that you'd perfected anger and it can be unperfected.
That's right.
I wonder the consequences of that for the positive quality. It can, if we cultivate compassion.
Yeah, you can lose it for sure. We can.
At all, does that ever?
No, it ends eventually at a certain point. It does. Yeah, when we realize, when we really cut the delusions at the roots, the way they talk, we've cut them completely. That's when they talk about when we get the subtlest wisdom, when we really have cut them at the root. That is the possibility, what Buddha has found. The virtues, I mean, there's incredible levels of compassion that we can still lose if we don't keep practicing. Yeah, I mean, the Buddha would say we've had many of these qualities to the most advanced level, but we haven't gone all the way to cutting at the root. So yes, we all know we can lose things, even the good, if we don't keep practicing. Absolutely. Yeah. Someone else? Any questions online? Hello. Who's there? Maywind, talk to me. You have to unmute, sweetie pie. Unmute, darling. Unmute, sweetheart.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Thank you so much for these teachings. I've been really thinking a lot about trying to detangle attachment, which is very huge for me, from love and compassion. That's and right. Realizing that the way to do it is to realize emptiness. I mean, it seems to me that I should be working.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I would really like to work very hard while I'm doing the other practices to get to understanding emptiness, because that's going to solve it.
That's exactly right.
What would your advice be? I mean, everyone goes, oh, take your time, but I don't want to take my time. I want to do it all at once.
Well, well, I mean, if you've done the work in the past lives and you're ready for it, like you will be able to, but so you just have to keep working at it. But I mean, the point is, to realize emptiness means you have to understand the way delusions work. So where you learn about delusions in this way we're describing here, this happens in high school. So you've got to learn that you can't bypass this, because ego grasping, the root delusion, is exactly the same in the way it functions to exaggerate, but it's a more subtle exaggeration. It exaggerates the very ontological status of things. So in other words, attachment to the chocolate cake, the branch delusion attachment, it over exaggerates the deliciousness of the cake. Ignorance, the root delusion, which sees not just the self, but everything as being intrinsic and inherent, that at the same time as the attachment, it's underpinned by this ignorance that is over exaggerating the actual ontological status of the delicious cake itself. So you can't just get emptiness without understanding the others as well. You've got to go all the way. You've got to know the way delusions function very precisely. You've got to know that they're all conceptual stories that are misconception. That is necessary for all of them. So as you keep talking about the delusions, the branch ones, keep remembering that the root delusion is at the root of all of them. So it'll help you educate you about them. And then you can be specific in learning about emptiness as well by reading the literature and doing the courses and doing the meditation.
The literature, which is the best literature to be reading? I'm not trying to skip over steps here, but I also want to know.
Directly about emptiness. You know, it's start with something like His Holiness's commentary on the Heart Sutra, for example.
Yeah. Okay.
Any commentaries on emptiness? I mean, there are some in the, you know, in the. I mean, when you study it in depth, I mean, it's really technical. There's different levels of it. But you start with something like that, darling. I mean, start with something like that. Just read it. Anything that's like that, commentaries on emptiness. But you've got to get the right ones, because there's lots of misinterpretations, and you've got to stick to one system. You know, it helps to do that. So stick to His Holiness. There's plenty of books that he's got. Heart Sutra. There's one called How to Become Who You Really Are. There's another one.
Yeah.
Those books. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Darling.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Who else? Yes. Yes, Tommy.
You mentioned about equanimity.
About what?
Equanimity.
I didn't today, but we have talked about it. Yeah.
And I've been thinking about those that make their happiness over somebody else's happiness. How do you deal?
Sorry, what? You're thinking what?
There's some people that crave their happiness.
Some people that crave happiness, create happiness.
Happiness from people unhappiness.
What's this got to do with equanimity? Why do you mention it in the same breath as equanimity?
Because I know that everybody wants to be happy and not suffer. So in other words, what about those people who make their happiness on somebody else?
Well, that's everybody. We all do that to some degree. We're all self-centered. We all base our happiness on getting what attachment wants, which ends up hurting other people. We're all like that. But see, the one about recognizing they all want to be happy is not some absolute thing. It's not some nihilistic thing. We'll all recognize that, and then we will start to want to find ways to help them to be happy, which means, of course, to educate them and not being selfish. I mean, everybody does that. That's the nature of these delusions. This is our method for getting happy. The stronger our attachment, the more we harm others. By definition, that's how we all are. Join the universe. So the whole point about hearing that equanimity starting point is recognizing everyone equally wants to be happy isn't therefore saying, oh, well, let them do what they like to get happy. That's not being said. It's simply the starting point, that getting out of your head and only having a love for some group and aversion for others. It's getting your mind to be more equal in the way you see everybody. And then you begin to grow based on equanimity, the wish to make others happy, the wish to take away their suffering. And that's where you develop wisdom more and more and more. That's the point. Right now, we spend all our time making only our friends happy. We want to try and make everybody happy. That's the starting point. That's the point about equanimity. Do you understand? You sure?
You have to think about it.
All right. Good, darling. Yes, Nana. Hello, sweetheart.
Good evening. Since this war had started, I cannot help by loving when Russians dies.
That's right, exactly. Ukrainian, by the way. So you go on. No, it's hard. It's easy to rejoice when they die, isn't it? It's easy when when the enemy gets hurt, you feel happy, don't you? It's natural, isn't it?
Exactly. It's
right.
the first thing that's happening.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
many people around me, like my people,
That's right.
this is how we talk. I mean, like, you know, we get them.
That's right.
So I wonder what would be the right reaction on that.
Darling girl, when we understand, as you know very well, when we understand karma really well, and this is where it's difficult, the karmic view, as you know, is that we've all had countless lifetimes. Ukrainians have been Russians, Russians have been Ukrainians. We've hurt each other countless lifetimes. We've been kind to each other countless lifetimes. We're all in the same boat. It's the only way you can think, big picture, countless lifetimes. So at this moment in time, you're labeled Ukrainian, okay? And this moment in time, people label Russians are harming your people. So you've got attachment for your people and you have aversion for the Russians. It's just, this is the world, the universe. But when we understand karma properly, we will realize that actually, this is where it's too shocking for our minds, though, Nana, that the bodhisattvas actually have more compassion for the Russians speaking as an example of a particular war, because they are just beginning countless lifetimes of unbearable suffering. And the Ukrainians are just finishing the results of their own negativity. It's hard to hear this. We like to hear karma when it's all nice and abstract, but if you put it right in your face, I mean, that's why I always use that example. When I went, in New York years ago, Richard Gere invited His Holiness to teach in 2003 and invited a bunch of ex-prisoners, 20 former prisoners, all of whom had done some kind of work in prison, like Buddhism or something, and invited some people like me as well to this conference to meet His Holiness and have talks. It was a wonderful meeting. All the people from the prisoners, black, white, Puerto Rican, and Mexican, American, male, female, whole cross-section of Americans, all talking about their suffering of being in prison. And they met His Holiness. So then also he invited 2 young Tibetan nuns who'd been tortured and sexually abused for several years in Tibet. And they'd been released, and they were talking about their suffering. They'd been, I suppose all the Americans probably thought, well, this is, if you want to quantify suffering, they had the worst of it, tortured, sexually abused. And so they were quiet and they weren't angry. And this is the whole thing. I want to say a bit. I've got to get back there I've got time. 5 minutes to get back, isn't it? You can run home with me. Get me on the Zoom. So, because they work with karma, it's part of their lives. Karma's been in the Tibetan psyche for 1,200 years, and it's been in India for 3,000 years. And if you're really working with it, it's like the most natural way to see the world. For us, it's still brand new and we have to work at it. For them, it's automatic. They just know everybody's had past lives. They know, so all those years they were being tortured and sexually abused, that was their practice. And they were quiet when they taught the story. They weren't angry, because anger is saying, how dare you do this to me? I don't deserve it. But when you have the view of karma, you don't have that philosophy. This is intense, Nana. They don't have that philosophy. So therefore they were not angry. Therefore, at the end, as one of them said, with tears in her eyes, of course, we had compassion for our torturers, because we knew we must have harmed them in the past, and because we know they will suffer in the future. This is too intense for our minds. So you, being a Buddhist, you do your best to think this. You be your best maybe to be happy Ukrainians aren't dying, but in your heart, try and have compassion. You don't give lectures to your friends. It's not going to work. It's not an easy one, Nana, but this is the Buddha's view. If we want to, this is it. It's not easy, darling. And that's what will keep you sane. Otherwise, you just get rage. And this is why, when I read the papers, the Ukrainians, it's easy to hate the Russians. That's what people are doing, hating. You hate the other group. And so it never, ever, ever ends. We can see this in this life. Do you understand? Do you understand, darling?
I do.
Do your best, sweetheart.
I will, Lama. I will.
Good, sweetheart. So I should go 7:40. See you all tomorrow, all being well. I don't know. Hopefully we can continue the discussion tomorrow. We're just talking about attachment and aversion at the moment, but these are the root. Once we get these clear, we can discuss the other ones. Pride. That's an interesting one, that one. We never admit to being proud. We love to all admit to being low self-esteem, but when we realize that low self-esteem is the flip side of pride. If we didn't have pride, we would not have low self-esteem. This is very sobering. So I'll leave you that to sit with overnight. We'll talk about it tomorrow. And then the other one, jealousy. Thank you, precious people. Sorry, I've got to cheat you of time today. I've got my schedule.
Thank you.
Goodbye, darlings.